certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Upon the discovery of Ciara Glennon's body, a serial killer investigator was flown in from the United States to examine the crime scene. Welcome to week 7 of Claremont in Conversation. Natalie Bonjolo joining you with Legal Affairs editor Tim Clarke, who's calling in from court, and criminal lawyer Damien Cripps. When police called in these FBI-trained profilers, it really did speak volumes at the time, didn't it?
That they thought that the seriousness of what was going on, absolutely.
Yeah, and Tim, who are these people that were mentioned in court today?
So, yeah, there were two, Nat. There was a chap called Claude Minisini. He was Victorian-based, but had some history with the WA police, particularly with his work with the then Commissioner, Bob Falconer. They were familiar to each other. So he was brought in first to work on the macro investigation around the time of Jane Rimmer's disappearance and then the discovery of her body, and basically stayed involved all the way through to when Ciara went missing and then her body was discovered. And then there was another very expert chap called David Caldwell, who was based in America, South Carolina of all places. He was a captain over there. Both these gentlemen had been trained by the FBI in the skills of profiling, but in different areas, I suppose. Mr. Minisini was more on the crime scene style of things and what a crime scene might be able to tell you, whereas Mr. Caldwell was your classic profiler, I suppose, that we're more aware of through dramas and movies, and also now true crime. And he was a profiler in terms that he would gather all of the disparate threads of an investigation and then try and build up a picture of who the person committing the crimes might be. And so they were both involved. As it turned out, and as we discovered in court today, they were both actually in Perth in person on the day that Ciara's body was discovered, as it would happen. And so close and trusted and integral to the macro investigation were they, that they were both brought in to view the crime scene while Ciara's body was still there. And then, probably even more surprising, the following day they were both permitted to attend the post-mortem at the state mortuary, where they both were on hand to observe that obviously very important and very detailed piece of forensic investigation and analysis.
And Tim, do you remember at the time, they obviously created a bit of a profile of the type of person police were looking for. Do you have any recollection of what they described?
Well, looking back in the archives today and some press conferences and some media that both men did, they both came up with what now would seem quite prescient profiling of the man that they thought was involved. Mr. Minisini, at the time that he was had attended Jane's crime scene, said in his view the killer was very organised, very meticulous, very controlled, not a disorganised sort of random killer, as one might think a person who would do this might be. And then Mr. Caldwell, for his part, he went even further and actually gave a press conference or gave an interview to the ABC at the time of Ciara's body's discovery, and he also listed various traits that he thought that this person would have, and they included having access to a car, and more than that, being a sort of regular driver of a car, who would also take care and meticulous pay attention to that car in terms of its cleanliness. He said that his job would involve being able to be not missed when at night when these things were occurring, and also possibly have either be living alone or having just recently separated from a partner, and also being away from family members. And all those things, as all our listeners will probably know, or regular listeners certainly, all those things are what the prosecution say that were facets of Bradley Robert Edwards' his life at the time. Now, obviously, he is only an alleged killer at this time, but from the picture that the prosecution painted, certainly in their opening, you can go down that list, those lists from both those profilers, and certainly pick out points that the prosecution have made to the points that were made more than 20 years ago by those two gentlemen.
Tim, can you tell us, you were there today, these two witnesses that you just were talking about then, did they come in on the basis they were expert witnesses?
Well, that was the thing, Damien. They weren't actually witnesses per se today. They came in, or their presence certainly came in through the evidence of Inspector John Leembruggen, who was a member of the macro task force. Right. And he was asked various questions about who was present at what times, particularly at the Ciara's crime scene. And it was actually Inspector Leembruggen, who was a detective at the time in macro, that escorted both Caldwell and Minisini to the crime scene and close to the body. And he was asked who they were and what their involvement was in the case. And that's how their involvement was confirmed in court today. But their involvement was well documented at the time. Say, looking back in West Australian newspaper archives today, there was actually even a picture of them both together at Claremont, going sort of around the area where both women went missing. So they were obviously well involved at the time, and as Inspector Leembruggen recalled today, were very, very involved on the day and beyond.
Tim, so just in relation to some of those personality traits that were raised about someone who may have been involved, potentially, I wonder how many of the listeners can tick those boxes.
Well, I mean, that's very true. I mean, anyone now would see themselves as an owner of a car or a driver of a car.
Very bright,
very
organised.
Organised, controlled, professional. Many people are separated from partners, separated from family. So that way, I mean, they're not hugely uncommon traits. You couldn't put it like that. But particularly the way that Mr. Minisini described the killer as a controlled killer, as someone who was organised, and as we know, the prosecution alleged not only was Mr. Edwards organised, he was actually premeditating these attacks. He according to them, he was out prowling, looking for victims, not stumbling across them. So, I mean, you're right, Damien. It's not a unique individual that they're describing there. And actually,
well, it goes even further, doesn't it, Tim? Like, because they went even further to say that this would be an everyday sort of a person, a normal appearing person, probably very pleasant, someone who would be the guy next door.
Yeah, socially capable. You're a normal, everyday bloke, basically, and not what we might imagine to be a serial killer. Not your Hannibal Lecter type. This is more your Mr. Jones next door type, which is exactly what Mr. Minisini said. But that was actually criticised at the time, or a little bit later anyway, by other criminal investigators and people who worked in that area, saying that this type of profiling at the time was too general, it was too vague, and it might even lead police down the wrong path. So even then, their involvement in the case was a little bit contentious, having been brought in from outside, not being, sworn police officers from Western Australia. But as we started off, such was the magnitude, scale, intensity, and interest in the case that macro police were willing to spend money, spend resources, and think a little bit outside the box in terms of what they would use, or the expertise they would use in their efforts to find whoever was taking these young women off the streets and killing them.
Tim, just in relation to the two, Mr. Minisini and Mr. Caldwell, did the superintendent give evidence about their report, or did their report become part of the evidence matrix?
Not as yet, Damien, no. It was merely a continuity exercise today, as the vast majority of the forensic evidence has been, as to who had access to the crime scene first, who was close to the body, who was in attendance, and obviously that goes to both sides, as we've discussed many times, on continuity as to any source of possible contamination of exhibits and of the bodies themselves and the crime scene themselves. But their actual findings, what they were telling police per se, hasn't come in yet, and we're not sure how much detail it will come in. But certainly their presence is a factor in terms of the actual evidence itself. And exhibits in particular.
There is the possibility that they could be called as witnesses? Or
we're
not sure?
We're not sure yet, because there is a rough witness list and witness outline being given to the court on both sides, but it's not being. We're getting sort of daily updates in the morning, courtesy of the WA Police, who are very kindly sort of flagging which witnesses might be coming up on a daily basis. But any further ahead than that, we're not privy to. So we're not entirely sure whether they will become. Either of those gentlemen will become material witnesses that will give their own recollection of their involvement.
Damien, is there any weight given to something that a profiler had said in the past into a current case? Is that taken into consideration in any way, shape or form?
I think the answer to that has to be yes, depending on the way that evidence would come into consideration. So that's why I was interested for Tim to enlighten us as to how we got to a point where we were talking about those two gentlemen today and how they came up. If they created a profile about who they believed was the person that was involved, or the person that committed these offences, and they were working on the case at the time, and they came and gave evidence and their report went in, it'd have to have some weight. I would have thought. Would you agree, Tim?
Yeah, I think it might, when we get to the more senior macro detectives, who we do expect will give evidence, it might become more relevant then if we go into the exploration of the direction that the investigation took at various points. I think that might be interesting, because then we'll get an insight into really how much weight the police were placing on these profiles when it came to, issuing questionnaires, for instance, or whether they were used in any way to rule out potential suspects or rule in potential suspects. So I think that might be relevant when we get to the more senior macro investigators. But as it stands, as I said, at the moment, it's purely a continuity thing, an access to the body thing, and from the defence's point of view, a potential contamination source of exhibits.
What other involvement did Superintendent Leembruggen have with the crime scene?
Yeah, quite a bit, Nat. So as I said, he was macro, so he was there when Jane was missing and then found. It was he that actually took custody of the knife that was discovered. It was he that took custody of Jane's watch when that came to light a week after her body did. He was involved certainly in the post-mortem process of Ciara, and he was also it emerged today and had been public previously that he was the police liaison officer who was charged with keeping the Rimmer family up to date on all the developments. That wasn't explored as such today. He was just asked, what roles did you play? But he was one of the senior detectives. He was actually in charge of a little team of detectives and sworn officers that were working on several lines of inquiry. So quite high up in macro, and he's certainly still high up in West Australian Police. He's an inspector now, which is one of the highest ranks you can reach. He's actually in charge of the police air wing in Western Australia at the moment, which is the airborne division of the police, and which is obviously, given the vast area that Western Australia covers, is a particularly important job that he's doing right now.
Was he? You said he was present at Ciara Glennon's crime scene. Mm-hmm. Did he happen to see who collected this pristine sample of hair, the RH17 that we've spoken so much about, that the collection of is missing in the video footage? Was he asked about that?
No, he wasn't. But there was some involvement there because he was jotting down and note-taking on some of the evidence in terms of that it being labelled, and RH17 was one of the exhibits that he took custody of, which was then handed off to forensic officers. But no, he couldn't. He really couldn't shed any light on who it was that actually took that sample and at the precise moment it was taken and what happened to it. But we are told, going back to being given notice of what's to come, next week the Path West staff members and senior staff members are slated to give some evidence, and we think that will be one of the main issues that they will be questioned about, certainly about what happened after that hair sample, that pristine hair sample, came into their custody, and then how it was stored for all those years after.
Was there any anomalies that you heard that arose out of Jane Rimmer's burial site or her post-mortem?
No, not really. Another of the witnesses that gave evidence today was another of the mortuary technicians, a chap called Greg Paul, and he was again very involved in Ciara's post-mortem. And there were a couple of things there that the defence really did try to pin him down on, because he again was seen in the video that was taken of that post-mortem, and the questioning of him again went to processes within the mortuary, cleanliness, things that were done that maybe shouldn't have been done. There were a couple of instances where he said, well, no, I definitely wouldn't have done that because that wasn't the process. But then the defence took him through the video. At one point he can be seen holding an orange sponge, which he said, oh no, I don't even remember them being in the mortuary, let alone using them. And at one point he puts the sponge on the ground and then picks it up again. There's some debris on his gloves, which he was asked whether he wiped that debris with that sponge after it had been on the floor. There was another point where he was questioned about a towel that he'd actually it sounded like he draped it over his neck, as maybe a tennis player at the Australian Open that started today might do. Although we couldn't see that on the video, so I'm only going by the description of that. So there were some little things there that the defence had obviously gone through second by second, minute by minute on that post-mortem video, and picked out just little things that, going back to the opening, this neat picture of everyone doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing at exactly the right time. The defence maybe roughing up the edges a little bit on some of the practices around the post-mortem of Ciara.
So this is Graham Paul, correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so he was talking quite a lot to the video, wasn't he? But it almost had that sense that, they would test his independent memory, play the video, which would then, in a way, contradict his recollection.
Yeah, there was a little bit of that, Nat. And Mr. Paul Jovich, Mr. Edwards' defence barrister, has been very, very particular and pointed about getting witnesses to say what they remember first before their memory being jogged by notes or running sheets, or in this case, the video. Obviously trying to prove the point that what you should have done and what you were used to doing might not actually have been what you did on the day. And Mr. Paul, to his credit, was quite open when he said, I do not remember holding that sponge, seeing that sponge, putting it on the floor, picking up it again. At one point he was asked whether he'd rinsed it in the sink or not, and whether the timings were right, because there were several sinks in the mortuary. So they were really, really going into the fine detail of that post-mortem, using the video as the ground zero for what actually happened, and then testing a witness's reliability to build up a picture maybe to come of, well, they said they did this one thing and then the video showed that they did another, so how reliable can the rest of the evidence possibly be?
It's really important for people to understand, Tim, during that process, a lot of the time in court it feels like people like Mr. Paul or Mr. McDermott are coming under criticism. It's not the case that they're coming under criticism. It's just we're trying to get to the bottom, or the judicial system is trying to get to the bottom of whether the practices can measure up. So the processes, a lot of the processes that I've heard of during the course of this trial certainly are dated. So it's not the case that the prosecution or the defence are criticising the people at hand. It's just a case of trying to get to the bottom of whether they can satisfy that ultimate question of reasonable doubt.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair, Damien, and I'm sure some of the witnesses might feel that they're being picked on a little bit.
As they often would.
Yeah, but to be fair, certainly Genevieve Cleary, Mr. Jovich's offsider, was quite open in saying, I do not mean to criticise. This is not meant as an affront to your professionalism, all those type of things when she was questioning last week. Obviously, that's a little bit of a tactic, so the witness presumably doesn't get grumpy and maybe a little bit defensive. I'm sure they do feel like there's at points they're being targeted a little bit. But I think Damien's point is absolutely fair, that they're only trying to get to the absolute truth and nub of the matter of what happened on the day.
Would this sort of questioning happen more in a case like this, where you are looking back so far that the defence is testing the person's memory in a way, like Tim mentioned, and less so if it was something more recent? I
think the best way for the listeners to think about that is that if defence see an opening to create a reasonable doubt, that's our job. So if there's something that's standing out where somebody potentially should have an answer for and they don't, it doesn't really matter why they don't have an answer. If they don't have an answer, then that creates that opening for reasonable doubt. So the short answer is yes. You would jump on that opportunity.
So every one of these minor, even if they are minor inconsistencies, all add up through the course of this trial.
No comment.
Is he allowed to do no comment?
I feel like I'm constantly answering questions that might be persuasive in the defence's favour. I am a citizen of Western Australia who ultimately wants to know the answer to this question as well. So I'm just in a world where I constantly work in an environment where we're potentially working against somebody being convicted. So I hope that I can offer insight into for the listeners into how somebody in that mindset would be thinking during the process of this. But still no comment.
Yeah, and that thing of picking holes in someone's work, I think that's going to become even more relevant later this week. We were given notice this morning that later on this week we will be hearing from Dr. Clive Cook and Dr. Jerry Cadden, who were two of the pathologists that worked on this case. But we also know, obviously, that Dr. Karen Margolius was the chief pathologist who carried out both post-mortems. We've also discussed that Miss Margolius passed away in 2010, so she's not available to give evidence. But her very detailed post-mortem reports still exist, obviously, and what we understand is because Dr. Cook and Dr. Cadden were also present, they can be asked not only about what they did, but as expert witnesses, we understand they will be asked about Dr. Margolius' reports. And so I would imagine there might be a few questions of both Dr. Cadden and Dr. Cook about what they think of the results and the conclusions that Dr. Margolius came up with. And if the defence feels, I'm sure, that some of those conclusions are in error, then both those doctors might be asked some pointed questions about their colleague, which might make for some interesting cross-examination to come.
Tim, you also heard today from another officer who attended both the burial site and the post-mortem of Ciara Glennon, and he detailed some of her injuries. Yes.
So this is a Detective Borden, who was a homicide detective at the time, still a serving police officer, senior serving police officer now. He was again on hand at Ciara's post-mortem, and his role at the time was, or one of his main roles on that day, was to note down on some avatars, so some pictures, pictorial representations of a body, of what Dr. Margolius was noting and pointing out, and it was his job to note those down on these avatars as he went, and there were actually 9 pages of them, and notes that he'd made, very detailed notes that he'd made of particular things that Dr. Margolius wanted him to note down were detailed in court today. They were at times quite distressing to hear in terms of injuries, of decomposition, of parts of the body missing due to decomposition, but also noteworthy that it was he that noted all the fingernails that were taken, particularly, as we discussed late last week, the left thumbnail that had been torn away, which is such a crucial piece of evidence, pieces of jewellery that were missing, and basically making a pictorial representation of what Dr. Margolius was noting in real time, and because he was the man who made those notes and made those sketches, he was the one who was asked to detail them today. So that was some of the first real detail of the injuries that Ciara had suffered, but what we haven't gone into in detail yet is the actual neck defect that Dr. Margolius was most interested in, and what we think is going to be the cause of death.
We've had many listeners of this podcast emailing and asking us if there's any evidence that Ciara or Jane was sexually assaulted. Was there anything revealed in Mr. Borden's testimony today about that, or not yet?
No, and from what we understand from the opening, because it hasn't been raised in the opening, I mean, there were certainly intimate swabs taken from both, but there has been, and so we pretty much know there won't be evidence of a sexual assault. Now, that's not to say that one didn't occur, but certainly what we have been told quite consistently is the levels of decomposition of both Jane and Ciara, because they were left out in the elements for so long, is that both bodies were quite significantly decomposed. So we might anticipate some questioning later on about what that decomposition might do to any intimate samples or any evidence that might have existed. But it's also obviously not for the prosecution to get people to guess or certainly bring up evidence that basically isn't there, and so is not going to help the judge. So that's quite a long answer to it. Probably what is should be a short answer in that there isn't any explicit evidence to come about sexual assaults on either Ciara or Jane.
Well, I hope that answers the question, because people are making that link, of course, and saying, okay, well, if Mr. Edwards has pleaded guilty to the Huntingdale attack and the Karrakatta rape, is there any evidence with the 3 girls that went missing? But of course, as you've explained, that's unable to be answered.
Yeah, and certainly can't be speculated on either, because it just does not help Justice Hall in his task. There isn't any evidence to bring.
Tim, let me be difficult. That's where you're meant to say, please do.
Well, I know you're going to be difficult, Amy, and that's why we get
Well, you've already said no comment today, so we're not very happy with you already.
I can live with a level of unhappiness. That's okay. But just to potentially help the listeners a little bit further, and the question is there any evidence of a sexual assault? Do I understand? Is that? And from what I can tell from what Tim said, there isn't. So there's no reason why there's not or anything. The question's quite simply that there isn't. And if you are a listener and you're trying to get to the bottom of this and you're enjoying the ride, and I know it's a horrible ride for the context of what it is, but if you are following along with a view to following along, which can be difficult at times, put that to the side, because there is no evidence. It shouldn't be something you need to think about at the moment. What we're trying to get to the bottom of is whether the person who's got the accusation took these people's lives. So that's the question at the forefront. So, and Tim, would you be comfortable in what I just said?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you probably put it a lot more succinctly than I just did. I was trying to get to the context of where the question was coming from, and we know where the question comes from. But I mean, there just simply isn't any evidence from any of the physical exams taken of either body to say that there was, and so the simple answer is no, there wasn't, or there isn't any evidence to go there.
Well, to continue with this theme today, that we're making everything difficult for you, Damien, we actually have some difficult listener questions as well, I think. One of the questions we've had is, would Paul Yovich have sat down with Bradley Edwards at any time and asked him if he did it? I imagine that would need to be asked so that he can plan the best defence and potentially know what areas need to be focused on and what areas need to be avoided. Is this actually something that a barrister or solicitor would ask their client, and would a client be likely to answer truthfully?
I can't speak for Mr. Yovich, and I can't speak for the process that he went through. I'm sure all the listeners understand that. But I can offer some insight into a couple of things. Firstly, I think most solicitors and barristers operate very uniquely. There's rules that we have to follow, and there's requirements that we have to meet. In my experience of discussing it with other solicitors and other barristers, I noticed that other people's techniques are different to mine. However, I wouldn't have thought that your starting point with a client for anyone would be, did you do it? Because I would have thought that the best starting point would be to say, this is the evidence, and this is what it means to you in the context of what they're alleging against you. the decision then is to whether you take in some instructions in relation to the evidence or you make some more inquiries about the evidence. Depends on the case at hand. But ultimately, I think it would be poignant for any barrister or solicitor to explain to their client what the evidence means in the context of their guilt or otherwise. And then they could have and potentially give them the opportunity to answer any questions arising from the evidence and eventually work to a point where they could give them a sort of advice about whether any defences exist. So, and when we talk about defences, we're not talking about necessarily just self-defence or provocation or any of those kind of defences. A defence might be, I didn't do it. A defence might be, I wasn't there. A defence, there's a number of defences. So the starting point is, this is what the evidence says. This is what it legally means to you. What can you say about that? And then we'll see if there's any defences available. So hopefully that gives some insight to the listener in relation to that.
Yeah, I think it is one of those questions that people do ask quite often, not to do with this case necessarily, but all cases, because it is a bit of an enigma to people that, that process with a defence lawyer and their client. Occasionally I get out to social gatherings and the first thing people ask me is, what do you do if your client did it? That's right. Well, if your client did it, we plead guilty, of course. It's so simple. What if they won't tell you they did it? Well, if they won't tell us they did it, well then we plead not guilty. I mean, it's not that straightforward. It's not that cut and dry. But I think the way that I just explained it then would give some people some insight. Yep. Another listener is wondering what the legality is with the detectives having retrieved the DNA from the Sprite bottle at the cinema. There's a lot of talk around contamination. How do they know if they got the correct bottle? What if he'd shared the bottle with someone else? Do they have to have reasonable suspicion in order to surveil and obtain the evidence, or could the police do this to anyone? Okay, so I can just see listeners, when this first came out in the trial, I could see people going, I'm not going to the cinema, that's it, it's over. All the movie sales had plummeted, what's his name? Leonardo had a new film out at the time and, everyone was rushing out to see it, but we didn't drink Sprite, did we? We all took our own drinks from home and took the bottles home with. The legalities of that are pretty complex, and I would say that I can't say for certain, but I'm working on the basis that once you put something into the bin, it's abandoned. So there's a few legal principles working there, and I don't have the Evidence Act to hand as into how the police might be able to come into the possession of that. But let's move forward on this question, assuming that the police were able to take the bottle and test it. The question then goes to a question of, as Tim will know, continuity as to whether they followed all the processes to get that bottle back to the lab and have it tested. But then there's other questions that arise, even though they might have seen the right person put the bottle in the bin, we don't know what happened to the bottle before the person got to the bin, and so all those things would have to be tested in a trial environment, and that's where essentially the question of this comes back down to the strength of the police evidence to support that DNA is the person's DNA that they are saying it at. And this is the fantastic issue about all these kinds of things. They just need to be tested. So hopefully that answers that question for the listener, but I think my instinct tells me that the listeners want to know whether if you leave that bottle in the bin, can the police appropriately take that and test it? So I'll take that question on advisement, and next week I'll have an answer about that. But my instinct tells me that I think once you've left something behind in the bin, it's open to be taken. You would think so. It's not like you're needing to execute a search warrant to go into someone's private property. So you would think so. That's right. And another thing that just arises to my mind then, Nat, is that there's cross-contamination issues right there in the bin. Once you've put your bottle into the bin, I mean, there's all sorts of other things going on in there. So there's a lot of issues with it. I'll just add a couple of addendums there. One, I'll be Damien's law clerk and say surreptitious sampling I did have a little look at before the trial started, and I think that's how it's categorised in law. I think there is some case law in Australia to suggest that it is okay for police to do that, but it's certainly more contentious in the US. And
as per this trial, Mr. Jovich has actually said in court that he's not going to challenge the validity of the arrest, because what the police then did once they arrested Mr. Edwards was they took a buccal swab, which is the little swab inside the cheek, and sent that off. And that's the pure piece of DNA that they relied on to actually charge Mr. Edwards. So it was a case of using the Sprite bottle to get reasonable cause to arrest him and bring him in, and then they took the DNA. But it's certainly an interesting legal question, and in another context would be an absolutely live question in any trial if that was the only DNA that you were relying on to accuse someone of such a horrible crime.
Okay, well, if you can bear with us for one last question, Damien. Listening to the degree of absolute detail being covered over every aspect of the finding of the girls' bodies so far makes me wonder about beyond reasonable doubt. I'm just wondering if in the panel's experience of other murder trials they have covered, is this level of scrutiny and detail applied to other accused persons?
Absolutely. I wouldn't have thought that anybody gets any special treatment, and I don't even think the fact that, I don't know, and remember I used the word think, because I'm speculating. When I say I'm speculating, I haven't worked on all the cases and I haven't been in the people's minds and the prosecutors and defence minds, but even in a case like this where there's 3 victims, I wouldn't have thought the level of scrutiny on the accused here was any different to a case where there was only 1 victim. I think the beyond reasonable doubt, all of the prosecutors in this environment know what they have to do, and they will tick every box that they can. So the answer to the question is, yep, it seems like a huge amount of detail has gone into getting this together. I think that's the case for any murder trial.
I think the reality is rarely do us, the general public, hear these details in such great detail. That's the difference.
That's the point, absolutely.
Well, thank you both for your time today. I think that brings us to the end of day 28, and thank you for joining us. For more details, head to thewest.com.au. We'll be back tomorrow with Alison Fan, and Tim will talk to you tomorrow. See you then for day 29 of Claremont in Conversation. Bye for now.
This podcast was hosted by Natalie Bongiorlo, produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.